Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 138, James Flinn. Just a warning, this episode does contain graphic information. James Flinn, under one of his aliases, Henry Wilkinson, was the only man hung in Albury, New South Wales. He was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1828, and he came out to Van Diemen's Land on the North Britain after being sentenced to 7 years' transportation under his birth name. His Tasmanian convict record stated that he was tried at Dublin on the 3rd of November 1842 and arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the 4th of April 1843. He had stolen a handkerchief from a student at Daly of Kelly. He'd been convicted 4 times previously for pickpocketing and stealing, and was on a bond for his most recent offence. He'd been jailed for 8 months, then 6 months, and 3 months for pickpocketing. At the time of his conviction, he was only 15 years old and 4 foot 6 inches high. On the voyage, he was flogged for disorderly conduct. His convict record stated that his trade was a labourer and a silver plater. He was first sent to the Point Pier Juvenile Penal Station and was then transferred to the Tasman Peninsula Probation Station. On the 5th of December 1843, he was charged with misconduct and he received 12 days in solitary confinement. In January 1844, he was charged with being absent without permission and misconduct and received a total of a week's solitary confinement, and his conduct was listed as very bad. On the 4th of November 1846, he was placed in 3rd class and received a pass, and less than a week later, though, on the 9th of November, the pass was rescinded for disorderly conduct, and he was again placed on probation. On the 28th of November 1846, when he was stationed at Point Pier, he was given 14 days solitary confinement for ill-treating a fellow boy. By May 1847, he was working on a farm but was found twice absent and placed on probation again and given 5 days solitary confinement. On the 4th of November 1847, he was caught out of bed at night trying to steal from a fellow prisoner and was given 14 days solitary confinement and was then sent to Point Signet. He tried to abscond on the 27th of June 1848 and was given 14 days solitary confinement, and a month later was caught again absent without leave and given 3 months imprisonment. On the 21st of September 1848, he was caught fighting with a fellow prisoner and struck a constable, and he was given 36 lashes. In November 1848, he was caught drunk and absent without leave and misrepresenting himself to be on approved leave and misconduct, and he received 14 days solitary confinement. On the 10th of February 1849, he was charged with assault and misconduct towards 2 fellow prisoners and striking one with a hammer, and he received 14 days hard labour. Nearly 12 months later, he received his certificate of freedom on the 22nd of January 1850, and he came to Victoria from Van Diemen's Land on the Alligator in 1851. On the 20th of June 1856, he received an 8-year sentence on the roads for horse stealing under the name of John Dolan, and he was tried at Carisbrook. In his jail record, the offence states that he was born in 1830 in Dublin and was a blacksmith, and he used his presumed birth name of James Flinn at that time. He got an 8-year sentence on the roads. On the 13th of May 1863, he got 15 days solitary confinement for assaulting a fellow prisoner. It also stated on the 5th of April 1864 that he got an extension of 41 months and 100 days to his sentence. The Victorian authorities stated he was a man of violent temper and conduct, and when under sentence he received nearly 5 years extension due to his violent behaviour. And his description in May 1864, a native of Dublin, 6 foot 5.5 inches high, sallow complexion, brown hair, hazel eyes, medium nose, mouth and chin, and it said that he came out on the North Britain in 1842 on a bond. He had scars on his forehead, his nose had been broken, and the first joint of his little right finger had been broken. He had admitted to have served time in Pentridge Prison in Melbourne under the name of Reverdy Johnston or Johnson or Flinn, and he stated in these records that he arrived on the ship Boston in 1841 or 1842 as a 10-year-old and was a blacksmith. On the 8th of May 1865, he escaped jail. And on the 7th of June 1865, he was charged with burglary at the Talbot General Sessions. And it stated, John Clinton, the man who committed a burglary on the premises of Dr. Southis at Mallorca in February and who subsequently attempted to escape the Maryborough Jail, was tried and convicted at the Court of General Sessions at Talbot and was sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment with hard labour in Maryborough Jail. The sentence will be cumulative on the sentence of 1 year's imprisonment imposed by the visiting justice as a punishment to attempt to escape from lawful custody. He was released from Maryborough Jail on the 3rd of July 1869. And in the Wagga Wagga Advertiser and Riverine Reporter on the 15th of January 1870, in the Narrandera Petty Sessions, it mentions a man named James Burt, and this is in fact James Flinn. It says James Burt was charged with robbery under arms. Senior Constable John Foley deposed that from information received, he went to Honey's public house at Cuddle. A man named Andrew Hayes informed him that the prisoner had stuck him up and robbed him of £1. He got a description of the prisoner from Honey and went out and saw him walking up and down the veranda. He appeared to be in an excited state and was talking to 2 or 3 men. As he passed, the witness seized him and threw him down, and as he was closing with him, the prisoner tried to pull out the revolver, but he handcuffed him and searched him. He found him with a revolver, capped and loaded in 6 chambers, a small powder flask, 2 boxes of percussion caps and a compass. He was informed that he had a horse and had cut its throat. The prisoner said he wanted it to race and it would not, so he killed it. It was a large bay horse branded JB on the shoulder. The prisoner gave several names, Anderson, Noonan, and he said first he'd been shearing on the levels and then he had come straight from Sydney. Andrew Hayes deposed that he was a labourer lately residing at Yanco. He met the prisoner at Cuddle. He took him first for the publican. He put his hand around him and looked to see what money he had. He gave him a drink afterwards. Witness had £17 and 2 shillings, all in cheques except a £1 note, and the prisoner asked him to go to his bedroom and said, "You had better give me that £1. And the witness hesitated and he said, "Then I will force you to do so." He took out a revolver, placed it to the witness's head and said, "If you attempt to say a word, I'll blow your brains out." He gave him the £1 and afterwards he demanded another £1, which a witness refused, and then said, "You can't leave this place until they go to tea. I intend to stick them up and you must tie them." He made an excuse and got out the back and told Mr. Honey there was a bushranger in the house. Matthew Crossan, a dam maker, deposed that at Honey's the prisoner asked him to lend him a horse. He said he wanted to go about 10 miles to wait for an old chap that was in there and that he would take all he had, that a dead man told no tales. He pulled out a revolver and showed it to the witness. William Honey deposed that he was a publican, keeping a public house at Cuddle, and the prisoner came to his place, and about an hour after, 2 young men rode up. They had a drink, and the prisoner challenged one of them to race. They attempted to race, but prisoner's horse wouldn't start. He came back and said he wanted the horse's throat cut. He took the horse down to the creek, and the witness afterwards saw the horse lying dead with its throat cut. And on the 5th of February 1870 at the Wagga Wagga Police Court, prisoner breaking. James Burt was charged with unlawfully attempting to escape from the custody of the jail on the 30th of January. Robert John Monteith deposed he was the jailer at Wagga Wagga. The prisoner James Burt was received in the jail on the 1st of January under warrant for robbery under arms, and on Sunday the 30th of January the prisoner was allowed in the jail yard for airing. Warder John Hoy was in charge of the prisoner at that time. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon he heard Warder Kelly calling out saying the prisoner had got out of the jail. He ran out and saw Warder Golden bringing the prisoner back to the jail from the direction of Mr. Robert Nixon. He asked Warder Golden why he did not fire at the prisoner, and he said that there were too many people about. The prisoner said it was his place to get away if he could, and their place to keep him. He had the prisoner brought into the jail again and confined in the cell. John Hoy, the warder of the jail, was on duty and in charge of 19 prisoners. About 3 o'clock, the prisoner passed him going from the pump in the yard between the jail and the work shed in the centre of the yard. In a minute or two afterwards, he heard someone outside the jail calling out, and Warder Kelly then called out from the window and said a man had escaped from the jail. He immediately missed the prisoner, James Burt, and in a few minutes afterwards, he was brought into the jail again. There was nothing in the jail that could have assisted him up onto the wall. There was nothing propped against the wall. He must have been assisted by some of the other prisoners by climbing on their backs. Michael Golden deposed that he was a warder on the jail. He was on duty outside the jail and was walking up the street and down again, and he turned the corner of the jail yard and shortly afterwards heard the sound of something falling on the ground. He ran around the corner and saw the prisoner rising off the ground under the jail wall. He got on his feet and ran away. The witness ran after him through the Wesleyan ground and shouted out to persons whom he saw to stop him. A Mr. Brock galloped after the prisoner and turned him into Mr. Robina's yard, and from that into Mr. Nixon's yard, where Mr. Nixon caught him and handed him over to the witness, who took him back to the jail. John Sullivan and William Plant, prisoners in the jail, deposed they did not know how the prisoner got out of the jail. The prisoner made the following statement: "I escaped out of the jail by my own assistance and no other man's. It is a thing impossible for any man to lift another on his back on that wall, and by any such means I did not escape. I watched my opportunity and escaped while the warder was taking a drink of water at the pump. There was a shed between him and me, and he could not see what I was doing." The prisoner was committed to trial. And on the 2nd of March 1870, James Burt, under committal for highway robbery, was charged with stealing a saddle, the property of William Wright at Kinglands on the Merrill Creek. William Wright deposed he was at Kingsland's public house and was camped in the paddock. At 9 o'clock, he took his horses to the water at the dam. He was away 2 minutes, and when he came back, his saddle had been stolen. He saw the prisoner the same night at Kingslands. On the 9th of April 1870, James Burt was charged with having robbed a sum of money from Andrew Hayes. On the 3rd of January at Cuddle and being armed with a revolver, he was convicted, and he was also charged with stealing of a saddle from William Wright, and a second count charged the prisoner with receiving the same articles knowing to be stolen. He was found guilty and passed with a sentence of 10 years for the crime of robbery under arms and 5 years for larceny, the two sentences being concurrent with hard labour on the roads or public works. His New South Wales jail record stated that his aliases were James Wilkinson, James Johnson and James Flinn. He was moved to Berrima Jail from Wagga Jail on the 4th of October 1871 and then transferred to Darlinghurst on the 31st of October 1872. On the 1st of January 1881, now known in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Press as Thomas Burt, alias Neighbour Flynn, alias Henry Wilkinson. Wilkinson is a known prison breaker and will require to be well watched. And on the 1st of January 1881, Henry Wilkinson, committed on 2 charges of murder at Albury, reached Wagga Wagga last week and had been transferred to Wagga for safety. The Wagga police recognised him as James Burt, who was tried in April 1870. His Honour then remarked that the prisoner had the worst countenance he had seen, and Burt replied, "If I come again before you, it will be for a far more serious offence." So in April 1881, known as Henry Wilkinson, he was convicted at the Albury Circuit Court of the murder of Mary Pumper. The victim's father, Martin Menz, had kept a wine shop at Lister's Gap near Gindera, where his daughter also lived, and at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of December 1880, Wilkinson entered the house. He went to Mary's room and with a revolver fired at her twice, inflicting wounds to her head and lungs. Wilkinson then shot Menz and set fire to the building. Mary Pumper managed to escape the flames and, drenched in blood, reached a neighbour's house. Wilkinson was arrested nearby later that morning. His victim died in hospital a week later, but was able to give a statement to police and identified Wilkinson as her attacker. And on 13th of April, there was another account of the court case. Henry Wilkinson, alias Burt, condemned for the death of the murder of Mary Pumper at Lister's Gap on Gindera Road on the 14th of December. This case excited great interest and the court was crowded throughout the day. It was shown that the prisoner spent the whole of Sunday, the 6th of December 1880, at Martin Menz's wine shop on the road halfway between Albury and Gindera. The next day he stayed at Martin Menz's son's hotel in Gindera, and left at night pretending to go to Wagga. He returned to Lister's Gap and roused up Mary Pumper, asking her for money. She gave him all she had, which was a few shillings. He then fired 2 shots at her, one in the chest and one in the head, leaving her for dead. He went into old Martin's room and dispatched him in the same way, after which he placed the mattress over Mensa's body and set fire to the shanty. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pumper had taken her child and fled to a neighbour's. A swagman camped out on the road close by, heard shots fired and saw flames, but could save nothing. He reported the matter to the Albury police, and they were on the scene within 2 hours. At 5 o'clock that morning, the prisoner Wilkinson turned up again at Henry Mensa's hotel at Jindira, coming from the direction of Lister's Gap, which was on the opposite road to Wagga, and having 2 drinks with the landlord, he went to sleep on the veranda. He was then, shortly afterwards, arrested by Sergeant McCruffy of the Albury Police, who had been put on his track by Mrs. Pumper. Mrs. Pumper was removed to Albury Hospital and confronted with Wilkinson. She identified him as the man who had shot her, and she died of her wounds on the 14th of December. The bullets extracted from the body and from the charred remains of her father, Martin Mintz, which were recovered from the ruins of the shanty, exactly fitted the 4 discharge chambers of the 6-barrelled revolver found on Wilkinson when arrested. No possible motive has transpired for the crime, and Sergeant McCuffey deposed that yesterday morning, in company of Mounted Constables Morrison and Brown, I went to Lister's Gap at Jindira Road. I saw the residence of the late Martin Mintz on fire. I saw 2 of Mensa's sons. The whole of the place was on fire. The roof had fallen in and part of the side walls. I proceeded to Mrs. Douglas's, and there I saw Mrs. Pumper and her child. They were both in bed. Her face and head were covered with blood from a wound on the left side of her head. The child beside her was also covered with blood. I then proceeded to Jindira, 6 miles distant, and I found the prisoner lying asleep outside the Mill Hotel. I arrested him on suspicion of murdering Martin Mintz, and then charged him at the same time with shooting to intent to murder Mrs. Mary Pumper. He replied, "I know nothing about it. I could not be at Lister's Gap and Jindira both." After that, he said he camped 3 miles from Albury the night before. I noticed something bulky in his coat pocket, and I found the 6-chambered revolver. 4 chambers appeared to have recently been discharged and 2 still loaded. I asked prisoner where he'd been shooting, and he said, "Do you think that I am fool enough to tell you?" He looked at the handcuffs on his wrist and said, "If these hadn't been on you, dog, I'd have given you something to do." On him was found a leather purse, a pocket compass, a knife, a meerschaum pipe, matches and tobacco, and a small swag containing wearing apparel. I was present when the prisoner was confronted with Mary Pumper, and I heard her depositions taken in his presence. She fully identified the prisoner as the man who fired shots at her. After this, I charged the prisoner with willful murder. To the prisoner, "You were asleep when I arrested you. I awakened you when I was fastening the handcuffs on you. You asked me how the swag came by your side. I did not say I found it on the road. You said the publican must have fetched it back. You told me that you were a minor when I asked you what you carried the revolver for. You appeared to me as if you'd been drinking. You were very abusive. The publican told you he found your swag near the culvert on the road. I saw no blood on you when I arrested you. I found a lot of horsehair in your pocket." Henry Mintz deposed, "I'm a publican living at Jindira, 11 miles from Albury. My father lived about halfway between my place and Albury. I last saw him alive yesterday week at his own place. I know the prisoner. He came to my place at 11 a.m. on Monday. He was on foot carrying a swag. He said in a course of conversation, 'I had a bit of a barney at that place.' 'What place?' he said. 'Down below the hill, a little way back.' And I said, 'That's my father.' He had a pint of beer before this. The prisoner remained at my place until 10 p.m. at night. He then went in the direction of Brookong, where he said he was going. This was in the contrary direction to my father's place. After a short time, I went to lock up the stable and saw a man without a swag walking in the direction of my father's house. I couldn't see anyone going in the direction the prisoner had started for. The prisoner had 3 hours sleep before he left. At 9:30 yesterday morning, the prisoner came to the door and asked for his swag. And I said, 'I thought you were going to travel on.' And he said, 'I can't find my swag.' He then went to look for it. I found it and I gave it to him. And he said, 'You rogue, you had my swag.' He stayed at the place until the sergeant came and arrested him. About half an hour after I found the swag, a man from Albury told me something. I then started to my father's place, which I found in flames. I met the sergeant and returned with him to my father's place. I saw my sister at the neighbours. I then returned with the sergeant to my own place and was present when the prisoner was arrested. I searched for my father in the burning ruins but could not find him. I have seen the body in the hospital and some clothing. I identified a portion of a shirt that's exactly similar that my father used to wear. I cannot identify the body as it is too much burnt. The whole of my father's place was burnt, and also 2 horses. He addressed the prisoner and said, "There were 2 Chinamen in my place when you came. You had a pint of beer first. We afterwards shook dice for 2 drinks. In the afternoon, we had a game of cards. You did say something about a young fellow named Harris. I saw nothing wrong in your conduct whilst you were at my place. I looked out on the road at the time when I went to bed, and you told me you liked to travel on a cool moonlit night for a few hours. It was customary for every night to lock the stable. I can't say if the man I saw going towards my father's place on Monday night was you. When you returned in the morning, you asked me for your swag. You looked at me just the same as the night on which you left. My father and I have always lived on most kindly terms." Dr. Kennedy deposed that yesterday morning I was called by the police to see Mary Pumper. I found her in bed, covered in blood. There was a small wound in the left temple, the edges of which were black. On washing the blood away, I found the skin to be scorched and apparently a bullet wound. There was another bullet wound in the right breast, which penetrated the lung. I dressed the wound and the patient was brought into the hospital. I went to the premises of Martin Mentz, saw the place in flames and returned to town. At 9 a.m. today, I made a post-mortem examination of the body lying at the hospital. The trunk only remained and the head. The body was that of a male. I examined the head and sawing through the skull above the eyes, I removed the brain. I found 2 holes in the skull, the margin of one being broken. The holes were apparently bullet wounds. I examined the brain and found 2 pieces of lead, one in each posterior lobe of the brain. From the appearance of the skull and the position of the bullets, it is probable that the deceased, if not killed immediately, would at least become insensible at once. August Mentz deposed, "I'm the son of Martin Mentz and I lived with him and my sister. I last saw my father on Saturday just before I left our house at Lister's Gully to go to Schreiber's on the Wagga Road. I returned yesterday morning and found the house burnt down. I have seen the body outside and recognised portions of clothing that belonged to my father. I know by the pattern of the shirt. I was present when the body was removed. My father occupied the right-hand room of the front house and my sister slept in the back room off the kitchen, a separate building. My father had dark hair turning grey and a small beard. His hair was short. When the body was removed, I recognised the clothes." John Gunty deposed that he was a labourer, late of Temora. "On Monday night, I camped 5 miles from Albury on the Jindira Road. The night threatened rain, so I packed my swag and proceeded on my way. After a time, it cleared up, so I sat down for a smoke. I heard a shot fired. It sounded hollow, as if in the house. A minute after, I heard another, and 5 or 6 minutes later, 2 more shots were fired close together. I could see nothing, but I heard a voice after the shooting. I could not distinguish the words. I stopped where I was and soon after saw a glare. I soon saw the house was on fire between 2 and 3 a.m. I ran to the fire, found all the doors and windows open. I could see the furniture all tossed about. In the left-hand front room, I saw 2 bare legs projecting from a bed between 2 mattresses. The fire was burning very fiercely and I could do nothing to save the man or woman, whichever it was. I called for help but no one came. There were 2 horses tied together in the stable and they were burnt. I came back on the road to Albury and gave information." Mary Douglas deposed that she lived on Jindira Road, 3/4 of a mile on this side of Menzies. About 3 yesterday morning, I was aroused by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Pumper, who had asked admission, saying her father had been shot. I admitted her and she was in a pool of blood. She had her child with her who was also covered in blood. The blood came from the wounds in Mrs. Pumper's temple and breast. I put her to bed and attended to her. The child had no wounds. The last time I saw Mentz alive was 6 p.m. on Monday night when he passed my place, bringing up 2 horses. I saw the flames of the burning house about 20 minutes after Mrs. Pumper left my house yesterday to go to Albury. She spoke very calmly to me but complained of great pain, and she said that she thought she would not live. So on the 14th of April 1881, it records that the jury retired and were away 10 minutes when they returned the verdict of guilty. The prisoner, in reply to the associate as to why the sentence of death should not be passed, said, "I have something to say, but I do not suppose it will ward off the sentence of death. I am sorry I did not defend myself. There are discrepancies in all witnesses' evidence and their depositions before the police court. There are points in which the witnesses' depositions are in variance. Everything that has been sworn to the witness box today is false and baseless. How a gentleman calling himself a barrister and having the depositions and my papers before him could make such a defence as been done for me today, I do not know. I know this trial was all cut and dried for me. Death I do not fear. Justice I never expected, ever since the authorities refused to accede my prayer to allow my trial to take place away from Albury. The law can take its course, but I swear solemnly I am an innocent man and am innocent of this charge." The Chief Justice then said, "Henry Wilkinson, you have just told us all the evidence taken this day in your case is untrue and that you did not expect to get an honest verdict in this town. You have found fault with the manner in which your defence was conducted by the learned gentleman entrusted with it, who urged every point that could be raised in your favour as ably as it was possible to do. You have also spoken of the discrepancies which were not pointed out. All I can say is there is not likely to be one person in court who would agree with you in any one particular, and I cannot for one moment see how any verdict could have been returned different. The case is the clearest I've ever met, with not only in my judicial career, which extends over many years, but in the whole course of my life, and the jury have found their verdict most correctly. A more atrocious case than yours I never heard of. You killed the poor woman, you evidently killed her father and set fire to their house. It is impossible to assign any motive for so black a crime. You got a few shillings she had to give you, and then, more out of wantonness and cruelty, you take the lives of these poor people and set fire to their dwelling. You go away, you drink some beer, you go back to sleep in the most cool and cold-blooded manner, and now you find fault with the way in which your trial was conducted, after every indulgence has been allowed to you. The law is deliberate, it has no object to gain in being revenged on you, it can afford no pleasure to take your life, but for the security of society and to serve as an example to deter others from such crimes, it is necessary to punish you. It is with regret that the jurymen and myself, the judge, have to do their duty, but the interests of society require that you should suffer the extreme penalty of the law." The prisoner here interrupted the judge, but His Honour told the prisoner he would not enter into any argument. Silence was then proclaimed, and His Honour said, "The sentence of the court is you are taken from the place whence you came, and there remain until such a date as the governor of the colony shall appoint, and thence be taken and hanged by the neck until your body is dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul." The prisoner again attempted to argue, but by His Honour's direction was promptly removed. The bravado and defiant attitude in which the prisoner sustained during the trial deserted him after leaving the dock, and he had to be assisted in the prison cart and has since been suffering from despondency. On the 14th of May 1881, a small report says it appears that Henry Wilkinson is quite resigned to his fate and pays great attention to his religious advisers. He is a Roman Catholic, and the priests of that denomination are most zealous in their ministrations. Henry Wilkinson was executed in the confines of Albury Jail on the morning of the 1st of June 1881. The execution was fixed at 9 o'clock a.m. Reverend Father Dunn and other priests were in attendance on the condemned man in his cell. The prisoner was preceded by the hangman and attended by Reverend Father Dunn, walked firmly and ascended the steps apparently without tremor. He then knelt down and received the last offices of the church, repeatedly kissing the crucifix but apparently unable to repeat any prayers. On the clergyman leaving him, the doomed man, who has not said a word since he left his cell, stood up and remained silent. His personal appearance was not altered since his trial, but his demeanour was more subdued. The hangman then placed the rope around the convict's head, pulled down the white cap, and the signal being given, the bolt was drawn. Death resulted instantaneously, as hardly a movement was detected in the remains after the drop. The murderer went to his account without making any public confession of his crime. Indeed, it is said last night that he told the jailer that he has committed many crimes, such as robberies, but asserted he was innocent of the murders in which he was condemned. The only sign of fear he exhibited was a slight trembling when the hangman entered the cell. There was a recollection on the 28th of July 1919, and it says Wilkinson was well known on the Mittimitta district for his violent temper. He was a man who, when annoyed, would not stop at anything. He used to drive a bullock train, and it stated that on occasions when the leaders, the two front bullocks, did not respond to his bullocky calls in a way that pleased him, he would get an axe and chop them to pieces. And just a little on the Menz family. Johann Martin Menz, known as Martin, was born in Germany, and he spent 14 years in Adelaide and then 13 years in New South Wales. He married Mary Maria Dorothea Walter in Germany in 1853 when he was 29 and Dorothea 24. They had 5 children, 3 surviving childhood, and they arrived on the ship the Wandram to Port Adelaide in 1854. Martin was farming at Angaston, South Australia in 1856. And in 1862, they were living at Stockwell near Kapunda in South Australia. On the 18th of October 1871, there was a warrant that was issued by the Albury bench for the arrest of Stephen Whitley, who was charged with stealing bedding and other articles to the value of £5, the property of Martin Menz at Gindera. So by 1871, they'd moved over to Gindera. And then on the 24th of April 1875, there was a notice in the paper by Martin Menz. This is to inform Marie Dorothea Menz, née Walter, late of Albury, who absconded with Stephen Whitley about 4 years ago, has not been heard of since. I intend to marry again without further notice. Whitley was 38 at the time in 1871, 5'8", thin-build, dark complexion with black hair, beard, whiskers and moustache, and he was an American, and it said that he was accompanied by Dorothea Menz, the complainant's wife. She had a description, very fat and blind of right eye. So on the 23rd of February 1878, it said, on Thursday last, a man named Martin Menz, keeper of a notorious den on the Gindera Road, was brought up at the local police court on a charge of robbery from the person. The evidence as it happened was not sufficient to substantiate the charge of stealing, but fortunately proved enough to convict the prisoner of sly grog selling. Captain Browning very properly inflicted the full penalty while the Act permits, a fine of £30 and 3 months' imprisonment. Martin and Dorothea's children, their firstborn was Frederick Ernest Menz, who was born on the 9th of November 1854 at Lyndoch Valley, South Australia, and he died at the age of 4 at Bethel, South Australia on the 9th of July 1859. Their second child, Johann Heinrich Hermann Menz, known as Harry, was born at Light Pass near Angaston, South Australia, on the 8th of November 1856. He moved to New South Wales when he was 16 and married Johanna Marianne Pumper on the 24th of January 1880 at the Lutheran Church in Melbourne. They had 10 children, 6 surviving infancy. In September 1880, Johann held the publican's licence at the Gindera Mill Hotel. By 1889, he'd become the publican at the Farmers Inn Hotel at Burrumbuttock, and in 1891 was the publican of the Australian Hotel in Albury. He held this licence until 1896 when he built and ran the Boundary Inn at Milburong near Wagga Wagga. In 1898 he ran the Lockhart Hotel, and by 1899 was running the Milburong North Hotel. He became bankrupt in 1900 and died on the 15th of May 1901 in Albury, aged only 44 when his youngest child was only 3. And there was a death notice on the 17th of May 1901. The death occurred yesterday at Albury of Mr. Harry J. Menz, one of the best known and most esteemed residents of the border city. Some years ago, Mr. Menz was the licensee of the Australian Hotel at Albury, which by his genial manner and by kindly consideration for his guests, he made one of the most popular country hotels in the colony. On retiring from hotel keeping, he took up land at Milburong and there endeavoured to obtain the cooperation of his fellow settlers in establishing a model township on the plans of his own. Ill health, however, prevented Mr. Menz from carrying out his scheme, and for the past 3 years he's been an invalid. While in the Riverina, he took a keen interest in politics and was one of the pillars of the free trade. He fought for his party not only with great vigour but with sound judgment, and his loss to the party, as to his numerous personal friends, is deeply regretted. Mr. Menz came to the colony from South Australia before taking up residence at Albury, and he was engaged in farming and hotel keeping at Gindera and Burrumbuttock. Mr. Menz had been in a very distressed condition for more than a year in consequence of an attack of paralysis in the acute form. And their third child, Maria Dorothea Menz, known as Mary, was born in Bethel, South Australia on the 26th of June 1859. She married Johann Fritz Pumper, a shearer from Jerodgery, on the 31st of January 1877. She was 17 and Johann 27, and Johann was the brother of Harry's wife Johanna. In July 1877, Johann put a notice in the paper. Notice, I will not be responsible for any debts contracted by my wife, Mary Pumper, after this date, having left my home without my consent. Their son, Richard Mintz, was born on the 1st of May 1879 at Lister's Gap. Mary's last words to her distressed neighbour, where she sought refuge, was to take care of the boy. Richard, her son, was only 19 months old at the time. Richard died, aged only 13, on the 17th of May 1892 at Glenlee in Victoria, near Nil. It was a gunshot wound that was self-inflicted. The article outlining this tragedy says, the Nil Free Press reports that a lad named Richard Mintz, 13 years, resident with Mr. F. Schultz at Glenlee, came to a shocking end on Saturday evening. Whilst an inmate of Mr. Schultz's home, he had been supposed to be going to school. On Friday week, however, Mr. Schultz discovered that he had been systematically playing truant and gave him a few cuts with a strap. The youth promised reformation, but on Saturday last, Mr. Schultz found that he had been absenting himself from school. He administered another correction. Later on in the afternoon, the boy was missed from the house, and it was supposed he had gone to fetch the cows. As he had not returned when night fell, Mr. Schultz looked around. He found that a double-barrelled gun kept in the shed for the purpose of shooting crows had disappeared. He came to the conclusion that the lad had cleared out and taken the gun with him. On Sunday morning, he instituted a search amongst his neighbours. About 10 o'clock, a farmer named Samuel Marks, who was looking for some missing horses, accompanied by his dog, had his attention directed by the animal barking to a thickly timbered patch in Mr. Schultz's paddock. Evidently something unusual was to be seen there, and Marks, making his way to the spot, found the dead body of Mintz. He was lying on his back, his clothes being nearly all burnt off his body, and the gun was lying a few yards away with both barrels discharged. Marks at once reported the matter to Mr. Schultz, who communicated with the police. Constable Downey went out and found evidence that it was a deliberate case of suicide. He'd broken off a small twig from a bull oak tree on which to catch the trigger of the gun. Then, standing with the barrels to his chest, he discharged the contents into his body. Death must have been instantaneous. He fell just where the fatal deed was committed. No doubt the proximity of the weapon to his body accounts for the clothes being burnt. Richard's father, Fritz Pumper, married a second time. Some of his descendants of this union continue to live in the Jindira district. And the fourth child, Frederick August Mintz, was born on the 11th of January 1864 at Greenock, South Australia. He married Rosalie Purcell at Urana, New South Wales on the 6th of January 1891 when he was 26 and Rosalie 18. They were both working at Pleasant Hills at the time of their marriage. They had 6 children, 3 surviving infancy. Rosalie had been born in Walla Walla and that's where they lived. Family trees have Frederick dying at Gresford, New South Wales in 1931, aged 67, but this is not substantiated by records. So what an awful ending to the Mintz family. Not only was there a double murder, but poor Richard, after the death of his mother, it seemed that he was in a fostering situation and it ended in tragedy with him as well. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.